Good evening or good morning, depending on where you're joining us. My name is James Lin, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Washington Jackson School of International Studies. Welcome to our roundtable, Challenging Hegemony, Taiwan, the Baltic, and the EU. Thank you for joining us this evening for a discussion about recent events sparked by Taiwan and Lithuania, but with global ramifications. My co-host this evening is my colleague, Guntis Mijins, professor of Baltic Studies with the University of Washington Department of Scandinavian Studies. Professor Smidgens will introduce one of our sponsors for tonight, the UW Baltic Studies program. Let me go ahead and first share my screen, and then I'll hand it over to Guntis.
Yes, thank you, Professor Lin. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to everybody from all parts of the world. The Baltic Studies program here at the University of Washington is in its 27th year. We have been teaching Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian languages for that long. We're the only university in North America to teach these three languages. We also teach Baltic history, cultures. Joining us tonight is a seminar on Baltic politics and society today. The students from that seminar are in the audience tonight. Often Baltic topics are merged into more general regional Scandinavian topics in our department. The Baltic program is able to sponsor and help organize events like tonight's panel thanks to very generous donations from our supporters in the community. I hope you'll consider a donation to the Baltic Program Fund. Now, I'll just looking ahead, in May, the University of Washington Baltic Studies program will be hosting the International Conference on Baltic Studies, the meeting of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies, bringing some 200 scholars to Seattle from all over North America, from Europe, from Asia. That conference will continue the discussion that we're starting tonight with a plenary session on the Baltic countries and Taiwan. So that'll be in May. Hope to see you here in Seattle. That's all I have to say. Welcome from the Baltic Studies program.
Thank you, Guntis. And I'll say a few words about the Taiwan Studies program, which is the other co-host of tonight's event. So the Taiwan Studies program was established in 2017 to promote research and education on Taiwan society and culture. We offer graduate and undergraduate courses, regular academic lectures, and public roundtables just like this one to help educate the public and build a community around studying Taiwan. We are also hosting a very major conference, and we're very excited to be doing this. We're hosting the 4th World Congress of Taiwan Studies just a month after the AABS conference in June 2022. This will be the first time that the World Congress is held in North America. It'll have scholars from, I believe, over a dozen countries joining us. And so also, if you'd like to help support our program and to support the World Congress, we'll be launching a special fundraising drive later this week where you can donate directly to helping support the conference, and any excess funds will go to supporting the graduate students of the Taiwan Studies program. I should also mention that today's video, as well as all the videos that are of our public events from the Taiwan Studies program, are on our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to our channel using this QR code, and you can check out the videos that we've begun to accumulate over the past couple of years. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of our co-sponsors, the Center for West European Studies, the East Asia Center, and the Ellison Center for Russian, East European, and Central Asian Studies, all at the University of Washington. Thank you for your generous support. So without further ado, I want to jump into our roundtable for today. We've invited 3 preeminent scholars from the Baltic and Taiwan to discuss contemporary events going on between Taiwan, Lithuania, the larger Baltic region, and the European Union. So Lithuania recently has accepted a Taiwan Representative Office, which is one of the first of its kind around the world to utilize the name Taiwan instead of an alternative such as Taipei. And through this, we've seen that the People's Republic of China has responded with regards to this potentially precedent-setting event. And so the questions we want to ask today are why Lithuania and the Baltic countries more broadly have decided to develop close relations with Taiwan, potentially at the cost of alienating its relations with China. What does this entail for the future of European relations with Taiwan and China? And what does this shift mean for Taiwan's international status and future? I'd like to introduce our three speakers now. Our first speaker is Luo Chih-Mei. So Chih-Mei Luo is the Jean Monnet Chair Professor at the Department of Public Administration and Policy, National Taipei University in Taiwan. She holds a PhD from the University of East Anglia in the UK. Her main research interests focuses on European integration, European single currency, economic governance, and UK politics. She's the author of 2 volumes in Chinese, reviewing the effects of regional economic integration, the cases of Germany, France, and the UK as EU members, and the Euro and European integration, history, crisis, and prospects. Our second speaker is Professor Daunis Auers. Daunis Auers is Professor of European Studies at the University of Latvia, Director of the Certis think tank, and President of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies. He has published widely on political parties, populism and the radical right, Europeanization, and economic competitiveness. His book on the comparative government and politics of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the 21st century was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2015. And finally, we have our third speaker, Zsuzsa Anna Ferenczy. Dr. Zsuzsa Anna Ferenczy is a postdoctoral research fellow hosted by the Ministry of Science and Technology of Taiwan and guest lecturer at National Donghua University in Hualien in Taiwan. Dr. Ferenczy is an affiliated scholar at the Department of Political Science at Vrije Universiteit, Brussels, head of the Associates Network at 9-Line, and non-resident research fellow at Next Generation Foundation, Taiwan. Zsuzsa is also a consultant on China, Taiwan, and the Korean Peninsula at Human Rights Without Frontiers. And between 2008 and 2020, Dr. Ferenczy also worked as a political advisor in the European Parliament in Brussels. So without further ado, I would like to allow our speakers to begin talking. I'll be quiet from now on. We'll follow the order that I've introduced them with. So we'll start first with Professor Luo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. And a very good morning to Professor Auers to Latvia, and a very good good evening to Seattle, Professor Lin and Daunis, and hello, Zsuzsa. We are joining you from Taipei. I would like to express my thanks to James first, because it is not easy to host such a cross-nation, cross-3-continent roundtables because of the 10 differences. Today, I would like to share some of my observations on EU-China-Taiwan triangle, a moment of watershed coming. Can you see the PPT? Hello? Okay. All right, so let's get started. My talk will divide into 4 parts. The first part is an overview of the EU's foreign and security policy. The second part will zoom in EU-China and EU-Taiwan relations. The third part will discuss whether a moment of watershed coming or not. Then it follows my conclusion. Let's start it from characteristic of the EU's common foreign and security policy. In foreign and security policy, the EU likes to characterize itself as a civilian and normative power. Its behavior pattern is that talking loudly but acting softly. This is understandable as the EU is an economic giant but does not have its own military resources and instruments. Then, what is China policy? A recent case in China policy is EU-China CAI. The EU defines China as a systematic rival in 2019. This is a clear departure from the EU's previous China policy, which they defined as a strategic partnership. Did this attitude change result in any policy change? Let's examine the recent case of EU-China investment deal, the CAI. The CAI was concluded at a very unfavorable timing. Externally, there was a US pressure from the new Biden administration. Internally, there was an anti-China public mood in COVID-19 pandemic. How about the outcomes? Actually, it's quite a victory in my view for China, but not quite so for the EU. For China, it proved that it could break through Atlantic alliance. It is quite a strategic achievement. For EU, it did get what China gave to the US in their trade war, but the EU did not get China's clear-cut promise on forced labor issue regarding Xinjiang. And when it comes to the EU's Taiwan policy, the EU adhered to One China policy. A recent case to observe is Taiwan-EU Bilateral Investment Agreement, BIA. BIA was negotiated since 2014. This year, I would say, the timing is never as good as it is now. On the one hand, the European Parliament keeps pushing. On the other hand, EU-China CAI was concluded. This is a precondition to Taiwan-EU BIA. And in substance, there are no particular sticky issues in EU-Taiwan BIA negotiations. Is the result optimistic? So far, not so good. According to the news report, the EU decided to delay upgrading economic relations with Taiwan. The CAI and BIA outcomes reflected simply the old policy pattern of EU-China-Taiwan triangle. If this pattern continuing, why we are having this roundtable today? Because there are some signs of changes emerging in wider European political climate. And we will leave this to Zsuzsa. She will tell us more. The public opinion, media, think tanks, and most importantly, European Parliament are becoming more and more supportive of Taiwan and against China. And for EU Council, the real decision-making body, it published its first ever Indo-Pacific strategy in September. In October, Taiwan's foreign minister visited Brussels for the first time. In November, Lithuania, an EU member state, even upgraded its diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So, do these changes imply a watershed moment coming? To answer this question, we have to answer a basic question first. How the EU defines itself in terms of CFSP? Is the EU satisfied with staying as a successful regional economy and only seeking its own prosperity and security whatsoever? Or should the EU be a third major power along with superpowers? Conventionally, Germany is more inclined to the first view and France to the second view. The German view so far is more prevailing within the EU. But will the changing geopolitics allow the EU to remain so? Externally, geopolitics is changing fast, and being civilian and pacifist did not guarantee the EU staying out of troubles. The EU, Germany in particular, under Merkel, has been avoiding direct conflicts with China for a long time. For example, disputes on Huawei's 5G could be downplayed as a business issue. The Indo-Pacific region could also be argued as a relatively lower relevance to the EU's geopolitical interests compared to Ukraine, Belarus, and Middle East. But can the EU and should the EU avoid confronting China again when it is an EU country at stake? Lithuania was punished by China for it allowing Taiwan opening Taiwanese Representative Office in its capital. So far, the most critical EU reactions were from European Parliament, not from EU Council and European Commission just yet. In my opinion, the Lithuania case will be the litmus test of whether EU-China-Taiwan triangle could move into a watershed moment or not. Here comes my conclusion. As a Taiwanese scholar, I would like to take this opportunity to make a formal appeal that this is time for the EU to stand up. In China's latest historic document, it claims that China was standing up under Mao Zedong, getting richer under Deng Xiaoping, and getting more powerful under Xi Jinping. This description, however, should apply to the EU more truthfully than to China. The EU has been one of the richest groupings in the world. It has been always very powerful in global trade and economy. Now, this is time for the EU to stand up in global politics. A punishment on Lithuania should be seen as a punishment on EU as a whole. It is not just a bilateral dispute between China and Lithuania. The EU must defend Lithuania, not just talking loudly, but this time should act unitedly, toughly, and firmly. This is not for Taiwan, not for the Chinese tennis player, but for the EU itself, whoever the EU wants to define to itself. Okay, this is my short talk, and we have 3 questions from organizers James Lin, and I will leave these questions to the later part. Okay, then go back to the organizer, Professor Lin.
Thank you very much, Professor Luo. So I'd like to go ahead and invite our next speaker, Professor Auers, to go ahead and start.
Okay, thank you, James, and thank you again for the invitation to speak today. I'm just getting up my PowerPoint. I hope you can see it. So, okay, I guess we're going. So, in my 10 minutes today, I'd like to give some background to the Baltic states, and also some background to the relationship between the 3 Baltic states and East Asia, specifically, of course, Taiwan and the People's Republic of China, and then finish by talking about the recent events that have taken place. And usually, when I'm speaking about the Baltic states, outside the Baltic states, I begin with a very, very brief history of the Baltic states, because we are amongst the youngest nations in Europe. And that means that we are frequently misunderstood, or sometimes publics have just a sort of very vague notion of what the Baltic states are. So the 3 Baltic states going from the south are Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And they share a common historical background, a common historical narrative of...
Daunis, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think your internet is a little bit weak. Maybe what we could do is we could try if you could turn off your video. That might help. And then we'll just depend on the audio only. Let's see if that works.
Okay, I've turned it off. Is it? Well, I suppose it's too early to judge if it's any better now. But hopefully, it's a little better now.
We'll give it a try. Let's keep going.
Okay, let me know if I need to take a pause. So the 3 Baltic states have shared, let's say, 800 years of various occupations: the Vikings, Christian Crusaders, the Swedes, and most latterly Russia, and of course the Soviet Union. But the Baltic states have experienced sovereign independence. The first period was between the First and the Second World Wars, when they took advantage of the collapse of Tsarist Russia and Imperial Germany to seize independent sovereign statehood, which was also, of course, recognized internationally. A period during which they experienced both democracy and authoritarianism, and which ended during the Second World War with a renewed occupation by the Soviet Union. And it was only in 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union in August of that year, that the Baltic states returned to the international field. Now, I mention this history because it is relevant for thinking about the Baltic states' relationship with Taiwan and with other small nations around the world who are seeking some kind of independent statehood, some kind of acceptance in the broader world, because the Baltic states do have a very recent history of seeing themselves as independent nations, but being occupied by a larger nation to the east in our particular case. So from 1991 onwards, the Baltic states very much returned to the West. And any international organization that you can name, the Baltic states effectively joined that. In fact, we often say there are no organizations left for us to join. We are fully entwined within the Western infrastructure of international organizations. Yesterday and today, we're actually hosting a meeting of the NATO nations. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, is over here. Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania are, of course, members of the European Union, of the OSCE, which is known as the sort of think tank of the world's wealthy, the OECD, sorry, it's the think tank of the world's wealthy nations. The European Union, all three states have adopted the euro currency. We are firmly entwined back in the West. And this is also important for us to understand what is happening at the moment, because the Baltic states have never been as secure, as economically developed, and perhaps you could even say as confident as they are at the moment, following these 30 years of successfully returning to the West. So that's the big macro picture of the Baltic states' development. How about the Baltic states and East Asia? Well, the first thing we have to take into account is that until very recently, there were very few historic contacts. In the interwar period, the first period of independence, friendship treaties were signed between Latvia, Estonia, and the Republic of China in the late 1930s, and Lithuania did not conclude a treaty. And this was the extent, essentially, of the contacts. There were no diplomatic exchanges. During the period of Soviet occupation, both the PRC and the ROC technically did not recognize the Baltic occupation, something which is frequently mentioned over here. And in fact, you can find in the Wilson Center archives a discussion between Mao Zedong and Nikita Khrushchev, where Zedong used Khrushchev's visit to China in 1959 and a sort of a bitter exchange between the two. And he used this as an opportunity to needle Khrushchev about the legality of the Baltic states' status in the Soviet Union, sort of hinting that maybe they had been occupied, something which also is sometimes mentioned in relations between the Baltic states and East Asia. But that essentially is it. Modern contacts initiated in the late 1980s, when the Republic of China started taking an interest in the post-communist states in Eastern Europe, which were casting off their links with the communist states, and then also the three Baltic states who were battling for independence. And there was here an opportunity to forge friendships and diplomatic links with new emerging sovereign countries. And we can find very deep diplomatic relations between all three Baltic states, but especially Lithuania and Latvia and Taiwan at this time. There were exchanges of high-level ministers visiting one region, visiting the other, lots of talk about developing economic contacts. And Taiwan was seen as an example for the Baltic states to follow. An example of a smallish country, although of course Taiwan is bigger than all three Baltic states, but an example of a smallish country which had developed a vibrant market economy. And that this was something that the Baltic states could strive to do. However, after independence in August 1991, it became clear that the Baltic states should also forge deeper contacts with the PRC, which had essentially been ignoring the Baltic states at this time because they were concerned about the breakup of the Soviet Union and the possible ramifications on the PRC itself. However, contacts with the PRC were needed in order for membership of the United Nations. And so contacts were made, PRC approval was gained, and the Baltic states did join the UN in September 1991. But political leaders made clear that this was an expediency. The Latvian foreign minister at this time, Daunis Auers, said very clearly, we are friends with the PRC because we need to get into the United Nations, but we see a future relationship with Taiwan as the way to go. And so after UN membership had been achieved, Latvia, of all the three Baltic states, took the lead in renewing contacts with the Republic of China. Lithuania and Estonia at this time remained more distanced. Estonia, because it was more focused on European Union accession, it was more focused on NATO, and it saw developing contacts with the ROC as a distraction from this. And in the case of Lithuania, there were two powerful wings, political wings in the country. One was a sort of post-communist social democratic wing, and the other one was a nationalist wing. And the two were torn on what to do with relations with ROC, and so there was a sort of paralysis, shall we say. And so Latvia zoomed ahead. And in January 1992, a consulate office was opened in Latvia, bearing the title, the Republic of China Consulate General in Riga, Latvia. And this essentially meant that relations with the PRC were frozen for the next couple of years or so. Latvia was supposed to reciprocate with a similar office in Taipei, but citing a lack of funds, this did not take place. And again, we see an exchange of ministers, an exchange of contacts in this period. However, little came of this, especially economically. And this is something to bear in mind also in the future. The Baltic states, when they looked to Taiwan, they were mostly looking to Taiwan as an economic example and also as something where they could gain economically from relations. This didn't pan out in 1991, 92, and 93. And eventually, because of the lack of, let's say, real economic benefits, at a time where the economy was collapsing, at a time where inflation at one point was 3 digits in all three states, eventually Baltic leaders began to sort of drift away from focusing on the ROC and began looking again at links with the PRC and began to identify perhaps greater economic opportunities there. And so when in July 1994, Latvia asked the ROC to close the consulate, this was done very much after it was urged to do so by the PRC. And after the consulate was closed, the president of Latvia made a first state visit to the PRC. Eventually, the mission was reopened, but with the more diplomatic, shall we say, name of the Taipei mission in the Republic of Latvia. And after this, so we essentially see a quarter of a century of very tepid relations between Taiwan and the Baltic states. So after great activity in the early 1990s, we settle into a pattern of cultural exchanges. We see education exchanges. For instance, in the realm of physics, there is a Taiwan Baltic Center here at the University of Latvia. There are Taiwan film expositions and so on, but really nothing much is going on. Rather, there is more action when it comes to the Baltic states' relationship with the PRC, especially because there are hoped to be some greater economic benefits, especially from the Belt and Road Initiative, although this doesn't come to pass, and also from the 16+1, which was eventually enlarged to the 17+1. And so, especially for this quarter of a century, Taiwan doesn't really feature in Baltic thinking. Yes, the parliaments occasionally bring it up. Yes, occasionally nationalist movements bring up the case of Taiwan, but it isn't really a major issue. And that all changes last year when a new Lithuanian government emerges after Lithuanian parliamentary elections. A three-party coalition of three conservative parties, which gained some kind of international repute because all three parties were led by women, and the prime minister also was a female. And critically, in the coalition agreement between these three countries, there was an agreement that there would be a values-based foreign policy. And one of the results of this values-based foreign policy was increasing contacts with Taiwan. So first of all, Lithuania exited the 17+1 group of 17 East and Central European nations negotiating with the one, which is China. So they exited it, making it the 16+1. There was a report criticizing Chinese telephones, Xiaomi, saying that they contain censoring software and encouraging European Union nations to not purchase Xiaomi and possibly also other Chinese telephones. And on the 18th of November this year, the opening of a Taiwanese Representative Office, the response from China is to downgrade diplomatic relations to a charge d'affaires level, so essentially getting rid of ambassadorial level links. And then it seems that these links with Taiwan are expanding also into the political realm. At the moment, we have 10 Baltic parliamentarians. So this is a picture taken from a meeting yesterday. We have 10 Baltic parliamentarians visiting the Open Parliament Forum in Taiwan, where yesterday they met with the Taiwanese president. And so this is what is hinting at the Baltic states perhaps abandoning this 25 years of let's say, a very marginal Taiwanese policy and perhaps heading into a new era. And that is all from me. I am happy to return to these issues and dig a little bit more about why now. But for the moment, that's it for this background on Baltic-Taiwan relations. So, James, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, that worked well. Thank you so much, Professor Auers. And I'd like to go ahead and invite Dr. Ferenczy to go ahead and join us and give her presentation. All right, Zsuzsa, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, first of all, to both the Baltic Studies program as well as the Taiwan Studies program for co-hosting today's event. It is really an honor to be in the panel, and I'm glad that I'm coming after these two presentations because I think a lot of ground has already been covered, but I hope that my reflections will complement and perhaps ask further questions because there's already quite a lot of questions that remain open. So I will now share my screen. Just one moment. Here. I hope you can see that. Yes. And so I will just. All right. So can so just someone just confirm that all is fine and you can see the screen, please? Yes, I suppose. Okay, good. So, well, I'll jump straight to starting my presentations because time is limited. So my presentation, the title of my presentation is an upgrade in the EU's approach to Taiwan is already happening. So, excuse me, there's just a technical issue trying to fix the full screen here. Okay, so this is the title of my presentation, and my main argument is indeed that an upgrade in the EU's approach to Taiwan is underway, which is a pro-European, pro-democracy, and not an anti-China move. And in this process, some Central Eastern European member states have been leading the way. So this is the main argument. And in order to elaborate on these points, I will first like to speak a little bit about the context that this is happening in, the dynamics unfolding in EU-Taiwan and EU-China relations, and then follow that up with my reflections on the way forward. So the context, well, the EU has been in a state of permanent crisis management since 2008, I would say. So that's when the global financial crisis happened. Then that was followed by a series of other crises. So integration challenges seen through Brexit, an unprecedented migration crisis, which still needs to be dealt with on a European level. Then the US-China geopolitical rivalry intensifying, an aggressive Russia, an assertive China with an authoritarian political system, and growing military spending. All of these have been serious challenges to the way, serious challenges and factors to the way the EU perceives its relationship with these countries and its self-perception in the world, the role that it wants to play geopolitically. The pandemic, of course, has intensified all of these perceptions and the EU's own self-perception. But here is one point, perhaps one of the most important points I would like to make is that we need to remember that the EU, the European Union as such, remains a fragmented entity with a variety of voices. And this fragmentation has really shaped the way it sees its role in the world. And the pandemic has also shown that the European Union is vulnerable to third parties. And there is a need to speak more about strategic autonomy, the European Union's capacity to protect its interests, and have geopolitical ambitions. Now, these are there's a lot of discourse that I am quoting here, and it's a lot of words, and the level of narrative is clear. But the question is, of course, how do we move from narrative to measures? So the idea with the recognition that technology and critical technologies are at the core of the geopolitical rivalry, the EU really needs to get its act together and consider intensifying its relations also with other countries, in particular Taiwan. So I think this context has really shaped the way the EU perceives its role in the Indo-Pacific. It has allowed it to have a common strategy on a European level for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and the China factor has remained central, leading to a consensus among democracies that China is a threat to Taiwan's security and a source of regional anxiety. Now, the question that has become more prominent in Brussels and in European capitals is, how can the EU remain relevant in this context? So moving on to EU-China relations, again, narrative versus measures. Well, there is a conceptual shift inside Brussels that has enabled the EU to see to move away from seeing China as a strategic partner to seeing it more as a systemic rival. And this is a language that also can be seen in NATO communique, most recently, where it says that China presents systemic challenge to the rules-based order. The pandemic has, again, intensified the tension in EU-China relations. We see that unfold both in economic terms, the lack of reciprocity, the lack of market access, and also in political terms, disinformation, the battle of narratives has all intensified the tension. There's a lot of different factors, but because we don't have that much time, I would not like to go too much detail here on the EU-China front, but to make it as one of the another point of my presentations is that at the moment, even though there is a new level of awareness inside the EU and among member states that there's a need to move on to have a new approach towards China, the EU remains divided still. So I think this is an important point. However, there is a convergence around the fact that the EU wants to continue engaging China and to cooperating with China, but the question is how. And in this context, this toughening stance on China has, in my view, presented a strategic opportunity to reconceptualize relations with Taiwan on an EU level. Now, my point here is that the EU, we talk about what we've seen in the past 2 years as a long list of positive developments and rapprochement towards Taiwan from the European side. However, I think we need to say that the upgrade that we've seen talked about, it was never defined in the European circle. So the EU never defined how far and how fast and where exactly it would go with Taiwan. It made it clear that it remains committed to its one China policy. But at the same time, we've seen that Taiwan was elevated on Brussels' agenda. And this has been shaped by that context that I described, the China factor, the pandemic, of course, the geopolitical tensions, the tech race, and the struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. So I'm just quoting here a few initiatives that took place in the past 2 years, again, in the framework of that narrative versus measures or narrative towards measures, because I think some measures have already been taken. So we've seen the investment forum held twice last year and this year between the EU and Taiwan. The EU is the largest investor in Taiwan, which means that the EU has interests to protect in Taiwan. And if there is tension in the region, there are serious consequences for the European Union. So I think this is all clear by now in Brussels. But the question is, of course, how to address this in an effective way so that the cooperation between the EU and Taiwan is strengthened, and at the same time, the EU remains guided by its one China policy. The European Parliament remains the most vocal institution. We've seen it table its first standalone report on Taiwan. And here I would just quickly mention that even this document says that there is a guidance of the EU's one China policy that remains valid for the EU, but it is time to see Taiwan on its own merit as a key partner and democratic ally in the Indo-Pacific. Very important. And of course, the bilateral investment agreement is also on the agenda of the European Parliament to push to work to get closer to that. The Parliament has also sent a delegation recently, and then we see that I think it's also important to make a clear distinction between who does what vis-a-vis Taiwan. So here I'm talking about European institutions, but also I think that at the end of the day, eventually, if anything is to happen on a European level, I think it will be shaped by individual member states, and every single member state has to do its own work at home and help that convergence on a European level. So clearly the Central Eastern European countries, namely Lithuania in the Baltic region and Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, they have been most vocal. They have also reciprocated Taiwan's generosity or solidarity, mask diplomacy and vaccine diplomacy. We've seen delegations going in between the two places, but this level of engagement of individual member states is very important. Again, I'm just using here a few tweets that were put out, again, to illustrate the level of narrative, how strong that is, and how important that narrative has been in shaping the language. So, for example, over a year ago, a German member of the European Parliament, Bütikofer, has joined hands with other high-level European experts, including a former German ambassador to China and Japan, to propose a new European Taiwan policy, to urge the EU to have a new European Taiwan policy. Now, on the way forward, well, I think that the EU and its member states must use the opportunity to embrace Taiwan on two fronts: internally on this shift in perception in Brussels, which includes both a shift vis-a-vis China, the way we perceive China, but also the way we perceive our role in the Indo-Pacific. So it's two-level internally, the shift on two levels. And externally, there is a momentum of Taiwan's success and the recognition it has gained in global health and technology. Now, just one word on Lithuania, since that is also one of the focus points of our event today. Well, as it was already mentioned by the previous speakers, indeed, there is this commitment in Vilnius to have a values-based foreign policy and to move from the 17+1 cooperation framework, which brings together Central Eastern European countries with 5 Balkans, Western Balkans countries with China, to move away from this framework to a 27+1 framework, which is to deal with China in a more coherent and on a European Union level and not individually, so that we do not allow or enable China actually to divide and rule the EU and deal with us individually, but to have a more coherent approach on an EU level. And also Lithuania's decision to move away from this platform, I think this also needs to be seen in the context of Lithuania's decision to diversify relations in the Indo-Pacific. And here I am also using the tweet put out by Lithuania's foreign ministry recently, that the Lithuania's embassy in the Republic of Korea has recently begun its work. And also, of course, we see Lithuania making sure that relations with the United States are going to be further strengthened. And so there's a lot of factors to look at when we try to explain Lithuania's decisions to act at the intensity and in the direction that it is going today. I think there's a lot of factors, but I think it's crucial to see that Lithuania has also made it clear that it does remain guided by the EU's One China policy. But this is a move to protect itself from external authoritarian threats that it faces from Russia and increasingly also from China, to protect democracy inside Lithuania, but also to protect Europe as a frontline democracy. Again, on the narrative versus or towards measures, we see that there has been a lot of solidarity shown towards Lithuania because of the bullying that it has faced from China as a result of its decision to move closer to Taiwan. We saw that the European Parliament delegation made it clear that Taiwan is not alone, and that we are seeing at the moment a delegation of 10 members of Baltic states parliament visiting Taiwan, again, a sign of increasing ties. So my last slide here would try to look a bit forward to see how we actually manage to stick to measures and really move away and from the narrative and put that into practice. So first of all, solidarity. We've seen already a lot of solidarity, signs of solidarity shown to Lithuania from other European countries as it faces the increasing tension with China. We've also seen solidarity towards Taiwan from European countries, and I think this has to remain. But beyond solidarity, I think what is important is coordination among democracies to address the political, economic, and military security threat that comes from Russia and the challenge that comes from China. Again, I'm using the NATO communique that refers to these two countries in such terms. We've seen international coalitions to support countries facing threats from China, such as IPAC. And moving on from the coordination, I think for the European Union itself, it needs to manage its vulnerabilities and to build resilience. And this is where Taiwan becomes more relevant, and to take measures against authoritarian threats to democracy. clearly, in practical terms, I think the European Parliament's delegation that visited Taiwan recently, their initiative to build a hub to combat disinformation, to build that hub in Taiwan is important. I think the European Union member states need to study the China-Russia ties and the implications of their cooperation for the authoritarian advance we see. And we need to increase awareness inside the EU of the scope and nature of China's activism and influence operations. So the pragmatic workarounds to enable Taiwan's participation in global cooperation on pandemics and countering disinformation is, I think, the way forward. Keeping in mind the context and the limitations that the EU faces in terms of its foreign policy, also the relationship with China and the United States, as already Professor Luo also spoke about this. I think the way forward is to identify pragmatic workarounds and to reconcile the EU's One China policy and its adherence to that with more practical cooperation, more regular and a more higher level with Taiwan. So I think I've come to the end of my presentation here. Thank you for your attention, and then I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferenczy. We've had 3 really informative and wonderful talks, and so I'd like to invite everyone back onto the screen now to have a brief, let's say maybe 15 to 20 minutes of a structured discussion with some questions that Guntis and I had come up with beforehand. So Guntis will ask the first question.
I want to first thank all 3 of you for truly stimulating description of what is happening now on all around the globe, actually, on 2 opposite sides of the globe. My question, I hope it's not the question is not too complicated, but it's actually, I'd like to hear each of you respond to this question of small countries, small states. Why Lithuania is a question. Why is a country of 3 million people leading the European Union's values-based politics towards recognizing a democracy as opposed to a dictatorship, or let's say not a non-democracy? Professor Auers mentioned that Lithuania's government has that coalition has a very strong mandate from its voters in the 2020 election, who expect a values-based action from them. Though there's a great risk for a government now to choose the weaker of 2 partners as its main partner in the region. And so I'd like to, the question of why Lithuania and why is a small country leading this battle for democracy in the world, to both Professor Auers and Professor Ferenczy, and to Professor Luo, the question of choosing a small ally. The Baltic countries, now all 3 of them have sent delegations to Taiwan. They are all shifting towards choosing the weaker ally in Asia to ally in the future with. I can imagine that in Taiwanese discussions of politics, there is a very serious discussion of how all in should Taiwan go into this alliance with countries that have a total population of 6 million people. There's dangers in allying with small countries. Your responses to this? Why small countries, and is Taiwan choosing small countries as allies now too? What should the order of responses be? I don't. How about Professor Auers first, and then Professor Ferenczy, and then Professor Luo then. Thank you.
I could maybe take the question of why Lithuania, because I think that this is a very important question. And I would stress 2 dimensions. Now, the first one is almost a personal dimension. So the foreign minister of Lithuania at the moment is a chap called Gabrielius Landsbergis. And Gabrielius is the son of the leader of Lithuania's independence movement in the 1980s, Vytautas Landsbergis, who is one of the true giants of Baltic history. Now, Vytautas Landsbergis led the Sąjūdis movement, and the Sąjūdis was the Popular Front for Lithuania in the 1980s and into the early 1990s. And Vytautas Landsbergis had an extremely close relationship with Taiwan. He was a supporter, a booster of having some kind of formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. He encouraged economic and political and diplomatic links. And this issue only disappeared because Sąjūdis lost the 1992 parliamentary election in Lithuania, and a social democratic sort of post-communist political party came to power, which had a very different approach, focusing on relations with the PRC rather than focusing on relations with Taiwan. However, Landsbergis remained a booster of Taiwan, and it should be noted that on the day in which this new Taiwanese office opened in Lithuania 2 weeks ago, on that very day, the old man, Vytautas Landsbergis, paid a visit to the office. So you have this very personal link of the son sort of continuing the work of the father, which I don't think we should underestimate. And the Homeland Union, which is the biggest party in the government coalition of these three political parties, is the successor party to Sąjūdis. So they are essentially continuing this policy. So this is I think, a very important thing to take note of. The second reason for why Lithuania is economically, Lithuania has nothing to lose because China essentially has no economic presence in Lithuania. And you could actually say that's true of the Baltic states as a whole. So if you look at FDI stock, foreign direct investment stock in Europe, you find that the Chinese share, so the PRC share in the UK, for example, is 46% of FDI. If you look at Finland, it's 7%. Sweden, 6% of FDI stock. And then you get to Lithuania, and the PRC share of FDI stock in Lithuania is 0.06% of total FDI, right? That amounts to about $10 million. In Estonia, it's a little bit more. It's 0.16%. And in Latvia, it's a little bit more than that. It's 0.39%. But in Latvia, we're talking about 59 million euros. And a couple of years ago, I dug down into trying to understand, well, what actually is this FDI stock? And most of this FDI stock in the case of Latvia was, sorry, I seem to have disappeared for a moment there, but most of this FDI stock was actually Chinese individuals buying residency permits. So for an investment of €250,000 upwards, you could buy a residency permit, which would give you a residency permit in the European Union. So rather than some kind of investments in capital, in building businesses and so on, I mean, China has virtually no economic presence here. And when it did have an economic presence, when it tried to have an economic presence, it wasn't welcomed. So the biggest infrastructural project in the 2020s in the European Union is being built here in the Baltic states. It's known as the Rail Baltic project, which is a brand new railway line, which eventually will link Helsinki to Berlin. But it's a new railway line, high-speed train, well, as speedy as they are here in Europe, which is very unimpressive by Asian standards, but still, sweeping from north to south. And China had apparently aggressively made a play for the contract, but they wanted the whole contract, to build the whole thing, similarly to what has been undertaken in other countries elsewhere. And repeatedly, the PRC representatives had been told, no, this project is financed 85% by European Union funds. Everything is a tender, and there are multiple tenders for multiple stages. And PRC eventually refused to participate and went away in a huff. And this didn't leave a very good impression. And the final thing that I would add, on top of this, let's say the personal link and the fact that economically there's nothing to lose, is that in recent years, of course, the PRC militarily has been cozying up to Russia, having military maneuvers in the Baltic Sea in the 2017, for example. And Russia is a real and present threat to the Baltic states because of the Baltics' historic relationship with Russia. The Baltics pride themselves on having said for a long, long time, look, we have to treat Russia carefully. Russia's intentions differ from what the leadership says. And then we had the events in Crimea, we have recent events in Belarus, and the Baltics are essentially telling Europe, look, we told you so. And so China's close military relationship with Russia pushes China away from the Baltic states as well. It's hard to get past this sort of military level of threat. So Guntis, that's a rather long-winded answer to your question. I think there's a personal issue here in Lithuania. Then there's the economic issue, which is not the case for other European member states, something we have to bear in mind. And then there's also this military issue, which is also quite specific to the Baltics. Thanks.
Thank you. Professor Dr. Ferenczy, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts too.
Thank you so much. Well, the answers Professor Auers gave is just so comprehensive that I'm just going to comment on that, I think, because I absolutely agree with the different elements that have played a role in why Lithuania and why now. I think on the personal, on the answer that you gave, quoting that this is almost a personal issue, I think this is why it is so important to always reiterate that Lithuania's decision to do what it's doing towards Taiwan is a pro-democracy move and a pro-Europe move and not a anti-China move. Because I think if we are not careful with that language, we only play in the hands of the Chinese leadership that wants to undermine democracy in our countries. So I'm looking back at, for example, the hearing that the Lithuanian parliament held back in April, I believe, to discuss the recognition of what is happening in Xinjiang, the human rights violations and the situation in Xinjiang, to label that as a genocide. And when, after this hearing took place, the reaction from the Chinese side was that this was an anti-China farce choreographed by some anti-China individuals intended to smear China. So I think it is important to make that point that Lithuania's turn towards Taiwan is inspired by this democratic commitment. On the economic front, indeed, you already explained so well with the figures, and not so shocking to see that we went from like the 46% in the UK to what 0.06 in Lithuania, and that might make us say that Lithuania had nothing to lose economically. But I think right after the decision to move out of away from the 17+1 platform, which by the way was made clear in Vilnius that the 17+1 platform does not deliver, and that the format does not provide an economic benefit that it promised. So I think we can use this economic argument for the timing. So why Lithuania is, I think the democratic dimension is stronger there, but why now is we can look at the economic aspect, that I think after that decade of undelivered promises, because the 17+1 platform was initiated already back in 2012 with the promise that it would bring much needed infrastructure investment, but instead it a realization after the tension between both the EU and China started to increase already in 2015-16 with an increasing number of high-level acquisitions from the Chinese in European member states, that this format is not doing any good, any service to those countries involved. On the contrary, it's dividing, or it's meant to divide Europe and also to increase China's influence in these countries. So I think that is the timing, and that's where the economic factor comes in, that even though the as you said, there was not much to lose economically. I think there is a clear understanding in Vilnius that it's much safer and sustainable, and the only way forward to really deal with China in a 27+1 format, as opposed to allowing China to exploit its relationships individually that it has been trying to build up. So I think I might stop there. But just one more note on the Baltic delegation, or I'm not sure if you wanted us to touch upon that at this stage, or maybe we can keep that for later. So this is I would stop here.
Professor Luo, the choosing a small partner in Europe, choosing a small country as the main ally, do you sense there might be hesitation in Taiwan to go that route? I'm wondering if there's an emergence of small state international politics happening here, in not just locally but globally.
Okay, thank you, Professor Smith, Ken's your question, and my answer to the question is that actually I would say that it is not we choose small country as our allies. It is Lithuania picking us. Actually, the initiative I would say is from their side, because all of you all know that for a long time, for a very long time, Taiwan is an oven of international community. We have very, very few chances, if there is none, that there is any, to participate in international politics, any international formal organization. The international organization that we participate, Taiwan participate, is only WTO. If we don't count APEC, APEC may not be, strictly speaking, an international organization. It should be seen, strictly speaking, it's just an international forum. So WTO is the only international organization we have. So let reality explain how unfair that we are treated in the international society. So I would say that we have been working very hard to break through into international communities and organizations for a very long time. But for many years, we are very disappointed. So I would say this time, the initiative is from Lithuania side. Any breakthrough in external relations for Taiwan is a political game. So we won't pick it is small or big countries. And I quite agree to Professor Auers and Zsuzsa's arguments in their answers. The point is not the size of the country. The point is that economic dependency. Why bigger European countries are so hesitant, or I would say so afraid to confront like Lithuania with China? It is because they are much heavier economic dependence on Chinese market. But as Professor Auers already explained, Lithuania has nothing to lose. As Zsuzsa already said, that Lithuania's experiences in 17+1 already proved that China's economic appeal is a myth, at least for Lithuania. Okay, so Lithuania thinks now is its time to get back to the reality. Okay, I would say that is a very pragmatic choice and very down-to-earth choice. So from my point of view, that the matter is not the country size, small or big. The matter is that economic dependence, how much your economy depended on Chinese market. And as long as your economic dependence is so much less, so you can have more economic autonomy, thereafter, the much more strategic autonomy towards China. Okay, that is from me.
All right, thank you for all of your very detailed responses to Guntis's question. looking at the time now, I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to table the questions that we had, and maybe if we have time at the end, we'll add them. But because there are a number of really excellent questions that have started to come in from the audience, I think we should prioritize those questions, and then we'll get back to some of the questions that we had if we have time. So I just want to mention to the audience, if you have any questions, you can always enter them into the comment section, whether you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook. But for now, I'm going to go down this list and ask some of the really interesting questions that have been asked. So the first question, let me just get this one ready. To what extent is this values-based foreign policy popular with or supported by the Lithuanian general public? And I think I'd also like to add one addendum to this and ask, to what degree is it popular within the EU, among the larger society and not just policymakers?
Well, I suppose I could take a first crack at trying to address this question. So, as Guntis already pointed out, the government in Lithuania had received a pretty resounding mandate to move ahead with this values-based policy by representing a majority of voters in the parliament. So that's one thing to bear in mind. At the same time, we should, I mean, we haven't mentioned this issue yet today, but the dominant issue in Lithuania and Latvia and Poland today is the migration issue on the Belarusian border. And Taiwan is a distant third if we're really talking about current issues, because number one is this migration issue on the eastern border with Belarus. Number two is COVID, because this autumn we have had a rather bad wave of COVID infections again, which has resulted in various lockdowns, various restrictions on the unvaccinated, and these really are the issues which are dominating the domestic discourse. And the Taiwan issue comes a distant third. But there is, I think, clearly public support for this. And this comes from the fact that, as we've already mentioned, economically, there is nothing to lose here. But economically, there is much to gain. So if you read what's appeared in the newspapers and in the media in Lithuania specifically about what has been going on, quite a lot has been made, for example, that in recent months, the Taiwanese public has started buying Lithuanian chocolates and other Lithuanian goods, and that Lithuania has moved up the chain of internet purchases being made in Taiwan. And this clearly is bringing some kind of economic benefits to Taiwan, which is something which, of course, causes cheer. And as I've said, there isn't a great deal of sympathy in China because of the anti-communist position, which is quite established in all three Baltic states, and also because of its links with Russia. So I would say that when it comes to Lithuania, and probably also Latvia and Estonia, there is quite a degree of public support for this, where there is a consciousness of this policy. As for more broadly in the European Union, I think I will hand over my colleagues to address this one.
I'd love to hear from either Professor Luo or Dr. Ferenczy.
I'm happy to say a few. Thank you. I'm happy to say just a few words from the European perspective. And I think here I would again go back to that important point that I always make about the fragmentation that we see in the EU. And we always have to keep in mind that it's difficult to talk about the EU as such, because we really have to remember what a diversity we have inside the EU, and different historical experiences like the one that we see in Central Eastern Europe have shaped our perceptions and our threat perceptions also as we speak today. So when it comes to Taiwan, I think the pandemic clearly has been a game changer in the sense both in vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis Taiwan, because the image that China has had in Europe for the past 10 years before the pandemic, I would say right after the global financial crisis, when China increased its presence in Europe to such a high degree, the image has been good in that period. And it has been so much presence that that's what has started to actually make European leaders and publics more skeptical about what this means in terms of influence that China can have in Europe. And so for the past 5 years, I think we started seeing slowly a change in the narrative. Again, I speak about the European narrative, but also the public sentiment has changed, I think, mostly with the pandemic. China's image has really suffered, and I think it was really not appreciated in member states how aggressively China has tried to push forward a narrative that really tried to prove that democracies fail and authoritarian strong governments succeed at fighting the pandemic. So I think the European institutions have also done good work in shedding light on such disinformation. So I think, again, the pandemic has changed perceptions and also has raised awareness in member states of Taiwan as such, of Taiwan's existence, and then Taiwan's importance, which is something that was picked up in member states, and Taiwan's relevance in the Indo-Pacific context. So I think it is positive. We are going into in a good direction, in a positive way. However, I think we're not there yet, in the sense that we don't yet understand what Taiwan's situation is in this region. Back in Europe, I mean, the general public does not have that understanding. And I think this is a very good moment, and it's almost a momentum that we should build on in terms of funding research institutes that help better understand the situation here and Taiwan's importance, and understand to link that the implications are broad. So it's not Taiwan. What is happening in Taiwan is not just in Taiwan. It has implications for democracy, for technology, and for the future of all. So I think those connections are not clear, are not yet made. And that's also because of the distance, as Professor Auers said, that Taiwan for the Baltic still remains distant. But I would say that being in Taipei at the moment, the same goes for the public understanding of Europe in Taiwan. Europe remains distant. It's a remote player that has the Eiffel Tower and I'm not sure, a few cliches. I would not want to throw in more cliches here, but unfortunately, a lot more work needs to be done to raise awareness and to play and to wisely use this momentum to really build more research on to go forward closer together. So I'll stop here.
Okay, let me make a very brief comments on these questions. That foreign policy is always composed by two elements. One is materialistic interest, the other one is values and principles. And the lesser you are dependent on the materialistic interest, so the more rooms and more freedoms that you can have for your values and principles. That's is pretty much could explain Lithuania's case, that because Lithuania's economic dependence on Chinese market is so much less than compared to Germany, France, and Italy. So it means that to the general public is that we don't have too many jobs to lose from Chinese market. There are not so many jobs at risk if we lose Chinese market. So since probably a small portion still dependent on that, but the majority of general public is okay with playing more values and principles in their China policy. Okay, so that is also why in Germany they are so divided on China policy, because probably half of populations is very reliant on a Chinese market, their jobs and their job futures. But the other part is not. So that could explain why the China policy issue in Germany is much more debating than in Lithuania. Okay, that's from me.
All right, thank you very much. My next question is from an audience member. This is a somewhat of a provocative hypothetical question. Let me just put it here. If Taiwan were to rename itself the Republic of Taiwan, and of course we know that this name has implications in terms of, this has been publicly stated as a red line for the People's Republic of China. If Taiwan were to rename itself the Republic of Taiwan, would the three Baltic countries welcome it? And I suppose we could also hear some thoughts about perhaps some of the other European countries as well.
Well, I suppose I can take this one. Initially, is it's directed at the three Baltic countries, and quite frankly, the answer is I don't know, because this is something, of course, which would be decided at the diplomatic level, and this would also be the point. This would be a good point to explain that there are, different policies towards China and different policies towards Taiwan in the three Baltic states. Estonia, of the three countries, is still very much the one which is most sort of, let's say, distanced from Taiwan. Estonia is quite straightforward in its foreign policy. It has been since the early 1990s on focusing on good relations with the USA, focusing on NATO, and integrating with the European Union. And I don't see that it would see too much value in trying to provoke China. Latvia is somewhere between the two, Lithuania and Estonia, that is. The thing that I would look out for is not something such as a name change. I'm not sure that the Baltic countries would necessarily welcome it, because this would lead to further complications in their foreign policy. I think the thing to look out for is what happens with the 16+1. Because as we've already mentioned, Lithuania has left the 16+1. And although we don't know the intentions of Latvia's foreign ministry or Estonia's foreign ministry, they have both also adopted policy that the best way to move forward in relations with China is to have a 27+1. So the European Union negotiating with China. And if Estonia and Lithuania were to leave a 16+1 as well, this would be quite a blow to the PRC's intentions in the region. And that is something to look out for, especially bearing in mind that there is a summit, the so-called 3Cs summit, coming up in Riga, Latvia in June next year, where Secretary of State Blinken is expected to participate, and also many other high-profile US politicians. And this might well, sort of around the time of this 3Cs initiative summit, there might well be some decisions on the 16+1 coming from the Baltic states as well. So that's a very indirect answer to the question.
Thank you, Daunis. Any other, would you like to weigh in? Oh, Professor Luo, go ahead.
Okay, my answer to that question is that probably the name change doesn't help Taiwan too much, but with some significant cost that we could imagine. But I would say that let's get pragmatic. If Taiwan EU BIA can conclude in very, very near future, then that would be a very huge achievement in EU-Taiwan relations, because so far Taiwan has no any big FTA agreements or investment deal with bigger economies such as the US and the EU. So if the EU could be the precedent, then that would be a very huge booster to Taiwan's I would say that political and economic gains. And that also set an example to the US, because Taiwan is so close following U.S. policies every step, but Taiwan-U.S. FTA still staying there, not going very fast, even during the Trump administration. So we hope that Taiwan EU BIA could conclude under such a changing, friendly political climate can be concluded very soon. So that will be a very, very huge gains to us already. Yeah.
Would anyone else like to weigh in? Or should we go on to the next question? Zsuzsa, go ahead.
Just quickly, one point, because I know we don't have much time yet, already running out of time. So I agree with Professor Luo on the pragmatic and the need to be pragmatic. And also speaking of the BIA, knowing that it is an issue that is quite difficult inside the European Union, and knowing the member states' skepticism and reluctance to move forward, I just would like to urge, and I always do that with my Taiwanese counterparts here, that a BIA is, I know what it is and I know it's important, but the BIA is not the only thing that is happening and that should matter. And I tried in the 10 minutes that I had, which I probably abused, and I spoke for longer than that, but I tried to explain that we should not judge how far and how fast we can go with Taiwan by having or not having a BIA, because in the meantime, a lot is happening between the member states. And I think that should be assessed also. So yeah, I'll just stop here.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that both Professors Luo and Dr. Ferenczy has raised, because there was a great deal of optimism with regards to the TPP as well. And we see that, the reason for the TPP being torpedoed really had nothing to do with Taiwan or really anything in East Asia, but rather about domestic politics here in the United States. And so I think it's an important point to think about too, that European politics is also a big part of what's going on here. Okay, I hope it's okay if we go over. There's so many good questions. Is it okay with Zsuzsa and Daunis if we go over by maybe 10 minutes or so? Is that okay? That looks good. Okay, thank you. We appreciate your time. There are just so many great questions here. But just looking at the time, I will move on very quickly. Another question is, how can Lithuania, or I guess we could speak more broadly about the Baltic states, endure possible retaliations by the Chinese government?
Well, I'm not sure what form of retaliation China could, the PRC, that is, could take. Because, of course, as a member of the European Union, you can't target sanctions on Lithuania. So there might be some kind of, let's say, hybrid things that could be undertaken, such as, attacks on the digital infrastructure or something like that. But the Baltic states have experienced years and years and years of this from Russia. So that wouldn't actually be anything particularly new. I think this might actually be quite frustrating, perhaps, to the PRC, because there is actually relatively little it can do apart from cut off diplomatic relations to try to, let's say, harm Lithuania, as the question asks. So in truth, I think that there is actually relatively little, if we're talking about conventional forms of relations, that China could do.
Professor Luo.
Okay, look at Australia. Australia relied on Chinese market so much heavily than Lithuania. Then they get through. They make it.
Chih-Mei, when you say they make it, you mean in terms of the changes in Australian policy towards China?
No. Just talking about the retaliations. Look at the case of Australia. Australia get revenge from China because of its anti-China rhetoric. And Australian economy relies on Chinese market so much. And China even canceled the imports, many important agricultural imports from Australia, for example, beefs and coal mines. But Australia never backed down. They make it. And recently, the Chinese government decided to reopen some coal imports from Australia. Not to mention Lithuania economically relied on Chinese market so much lesser than Australian economy. So that is just a few comments.
Okay, I understand now. Thank you for the clarification. So Australia held their ground and they somewhat succeeded essentially. And so you're saying that Lithuania or the other Baltic states actually have much less to worry about. Yeah, okay. Anyone else want to comment? Yeah, Zsuzsa, please.
Yes, thank you. So the question is, how can Lithuania endure possible retaliations by the Chinese government? I think the answer to that is it has to be a European response to Lithuania facing bullying by a third country. It has to be something that Lithuania does not have to face alone, but that's where the European countries come into its support. So I think this has to be, and this has been already visible on the narrative level again. So we saw that the president of the Commission and of the Council responded to a joint letter to them saying that they will not, that the European Union will not allow such threats, such as the threat that Lithuania is facing from China, and will step up against such threats. So I think it's maybe an opportunity is not the right word here, but it definitely asks for a response on a European level. So Lithuania did face the threat from Lithuanian businesses did turn to their foreign ministry to ask for help when the export permits were suspended by the Chinese as a result of the retaliation by the Chinese government, by China. And so we did say earlier that there's no economic cost. Well, there is some economic cost, but clearly I think that it is the European response that needs to be emphasized here.
Yep. Agree.
Okay, great. Well, let me move on to the next question. And this is also a very provocative question here. So what is the ultimate risk for the EU if they broke with the One China policy? Maybe I could ask Dr. Ferenczy to answer this first because she raised this in her talk.
So what is the ultimate risk for the EU to break with One China policy? Well, there is no interest to break with the One China policy. I think we need to make that clear that no government, as friendly as Lithuania has been to Taiwan, there is no interest to break away from that. So I don't see much value in feeding that narrative that the EU might be moving in that direction, because it does create false expectations and just misplaced interpretations of what the EU is doing. I think we need to understand that the EU's turn, or member states, and also the EU's turn towards Taiwan is to be understood in the context of its awareness of the implications of allowing too much Chinese presence inside the EU, which has allowed the Chinese side to increase its influence and undermine democracy with an authoritarian threat inside the EU. And there is a need to have a common approach towards addressing that threat. So, I mean, I don't mean to avoid the question, but I'm just making it clear that in my understanding, I am pretty clear about this, because we can speculate, or we can just say, what this would mean, but I don't see value in it. I want to return to the real situation we're facing, to welcome European narrative on Taiwan, to encourage more European interest in Taiwan, to encourage more Taiwanese interest in Europe, and to understand that we will continue, as in the European Union institutions and the Commission will continue developing, or maybe not further developing, but maintaining that cooperation with China in the context of our One China policy. And we say that we have the right as member states to develop cooperation with other entities, let's put it this way. And this is, again, I'm not obsessed with narrative, but narrative is very important to shape perception. So this is, again, coming out of the European Commission, and in the same letter that I just referred to, that the European Commission President and the Council, so Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel jointly addressed this issue, saying that, well, we support Lithuania when facing external threats from any authoritarian governments, and also we are guided by the EU's One China policy, but it is the right of member states to do further cooperation with Taiwan. So I think this is important that it's at this level, and so I'll stop here to allow others to speak as well.
I see Professor Luo has her hand up already.
Yep, I agree with Zsuzsa that it's not realistic to talk about breaking One China policy for EU. It's not realistic, and it's not in their interest, as Zsuzsa already said. But I would say that One China policy EU can still having its One China policy, EU can have its own interpretations. Have your own interpretations, different interpretations from Chinese governments can already allow many possibilities, even changes happening in EU-Taiwan relations. As Zsuzsa said, that pro-democracy or pro-Taiwan not necessarily has to be anti-China. That is not the opposite. Okay, that is just a very quick supplement. Just EU can has its own interpretation to its own One China policy. Yep.
That's a very good point from Professor Luo as well, and that's the case with U.S.-Taiwan relations ever since roughly 1979. That there have been modifications to the interpretation of the United States One China policy.
Yeah.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on this question, or shall we move on? No? Okay. Wonderful. I would like to ask the question that we had tabled earlier, and I think this might be our last question, just respecting our speakers' time, since they have other obligations for today. So I would like to pose this question. What does this entail for Taiwan's future? Does this give cover, for example, or open the door for Taiwan to pursue a possible solution to a return to the international community, possibly even the United Nations, as Taiwan and not as the Republic of China? And I think that this is a question I will first ask of Professor Luo.
Okay, thanks, James. Thanks for your question. As I said, actually, the initiative is never at Taiwan's hand. It's really the likelihood really depends on how determined and how strong that bigger powers such as the US and its alliance, such as the Japan and the EU, would like to uphold Taiwan in international community. Okay, as a quite isolated small country, we are not in a strong position to control the direction of how possible or how likely that Taiwan can return to international community. We hope so. We always hope so. And we have been waiting for very long. And we hope that the timing is coming. Yeah.
Any thoughts from Daunis or from Zsuzsa?
Well, I could sort of link this to one of the questions which was asked also about sorry, I've lost my drift here, but in answer to this question, yes, that's right. What are the lessons from the Baltic states for Taiwan? And one thing that I would say is that small steps can be important steps. So during the 50 years of the Soviet occupation in the Baltic states, at many times it seemed to be a rather hopeless task. That the Soviet Union was all powerful, the Baltic states were weak, and there was little that could be done. But there were activists in the international community of both ethnic Balts, emigres, like Guntis's and my own families. There were political supporters of the Baltic states, especially in America, senators, sometimes also in presidential offices, and small steps, small recognitions can, in the long run, also prove to be quite valuable steps. So I don't know if this is a key moment for the development of Taiwan's, let's say, international strategy, but it certainly is an important moment. How important, only time will tell.
Yeah. Yes.
Zsuzsa, would you like to have the last word?
Well, just to say that I absolutely agree. Thank you, James. I agree with Professor Auers on the lessons from the Baltic states, that small steps can be important steps. And I think Taiwan and the Taiwanese government, I think really, if I may say so, I sometimes feel that that there is an urge to go faster. And we've seen so much unfold in the past 2 years, and I think there's a lot happening. And I just always like to remain realistic so that we avoid that expectations are not met at the end of the day. So I think also in the case of Lithuania and the great many things that Lithuania or Vilnius has decided to do vis-a-vis Taiwan, I think it's absolutely, I support, and I think it's great. But I think we also need to remember from the Taiwanese perspective that what Lithuania is doing right now is setting a precedent for other countries to follow. But we should not expect that other countries will absolutely follow just because Lithuania set a strong and values-based precedent, because that's where the economic aspect comes in. And I think there's this game or this balancing act between the economic and the values-based factors, and sometimes one can overwhelm the other. So in the case of Lithuania, I think all of us agreed here how big a role the democratic and the values-based approach plays as opposed to the economic economic factor. But I think, again, I support going forward, but I think I always like to stay more realistic and more grounded in reality and in the things that we've seen and the constraints, the very good understanding of what constraints we face. So I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I think it's important to understand things in their own context. And I hope that instead of expecting the big thing to happen, and I think the fact that we had that question, actually, what is the ultimate risk to break with one China policy, for me is indicative of how people see things in black and white. So I think we need to appreciate, and we need to talk about, as experts or as professors in academia, we need to talk about what is already happening and why what is happening right now is important. Why all the many exchanges between Lithuania and the pragmatic approach is more important than seeing that BIA started next Monday. It's not going to happen. But yeah, that would be my.
Thank you, Dr. Ferenczy. Well, that's a very sober reminder, but I think it's a good note to end on. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers. Thank you, Professor Luo. Thank you, Professor Auers. Thank you, Dr. Ferenczy, for joining us, especially Professor Auers joining us in the middle of the morning for you in the Baltic. So thank you all for joining us. We learned a lot. And I look forward to hearing more from you, seeing more of your writing about these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I take a photo?
Thank you for organizing this. Okay.
Can I take a photo?
Oh,
Can I take a photo?
Sure.
Yeah, we can take a screenshot for our Oh, okay. Yes,
Yes.
that works too.
Smile, everyone. Say hi. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Nice
Thank
to
you.
join you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, James. Thank you, Professor Daunis, Professor Auers, and Zsuzsa. And see you very soon, Zsuzsa.
Yes, I'll see
All
you
right. Thank you,
soon.
everybody.
Nice
Thank you
to
for
Yeah.
joining us.
see you all.
Yeah.